Hello, my geeslings. It's Mother Goose Robinson with the introduction to episode 35 of Robinson's podcast. And if you're watching the video, I'm wrangling Pins as usual, who's causing mischief. But this episode is with Barry Lamb, who is the host of the podcast Hi-Phi Nation, which you'll hear plenty about it during the episode, but it's a phenomenal show. I'm not going to say any more than that, other than definitely check it out. So Barry did his graduate work at Princeton. He was then a professor at Vassar and is now going to UC Riverside. Congratulations to Barry. And in this episode, we mainly talk about his show. And in particular, we talk about a series. He did a 3-part series with Christina Van Dyke of Columbia in this past season, season 5, and it's on monsters and philosophy. So there's one on zombies, there's one on cannibals, there's one on vampires. And I, in addition to being a philosophy person, am a big fantasy person. So I really loved those episodes and really loved getting to talk to Barry about them. But we also talk about what it's like to do public philosophy when you're in academia. We talk about David Lewis. He had a great series on David Lewis. We talk a bit about what's to come. Season 6 is going to be about philosophy and the future. And it was all in all just a great conversation. I learned a lot because we also talked a bit about podcasting, and Barry gave me some tips, but I think they're fun even to listen to for non-podcasters. And with all that being said, I hope you really enjoy this episode as much as I did, because it was a special one. So I am a big fan of the podcast Hi-Phi Nation that you host and produce. I've listened to all 5 seasons.
Let me put the logo in view right there. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, so I've listened to all 5 seasons. I'm looking forward to the 6th season. And my show is very different from yours in that it is not particularly ambitious. And it's also in that it's not a narrative. There's no real writing that goes into it. It's not highly produced. And I mean, yours is super ambitious because I think you do pretty much all of it yourself, right?
I do. People don't believe that, but it's been that way since the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, I think it's better than like NPR produced podcasts as far as the production value goes. It's really
no,
great.
that's a little too far. You know, those shows have teams of at least 4, and some of the other more popular shows have teams of like 20, you know?
Well, I prefer it maybe because it's, I mean, slightly more minimalist than theirs. But what I'm curious about is in a world where academia doesn't particularly reward public philosophy, and at least on a general level, the population doesn't know too much, or as far as I can tell, care too much about academic analytic philosophy. What prompted you to start this show?
Well, everything that you're describing is why I started the show. You know, in a world where that's all true, and I agree with you, like, why shouldn't they? Right. So it's kind of like, I'm old enough to remember a time when econ wasn't cool. Right. Like, it wasn't like a thing that parents were telling kids that they have to major in, or kids were in high school and thinking, oh, great, there's like this econ class that's a requirement. But sometime around the 2000s, sort of around when Freakonomics was published, but it wasn't just Freakonomics as a book that was published. There was a whole phenomena behind that. Econ kind of reinvented itself. And all of a sudden, everybody cared about it, right? It's like the fastest growing major for like a decade and a half now, I think, right? And it's one of the social sciences where when people major in it, nobody in the outside world thinks, like, what are you going to do with that, right? And so forth. And the same was true of certain other fields, I think, in academia. And so I thought at the time, why not philosophy? And in particular, why not the kind of philosophy that I kind of grew up on. Not really, not grew up, but grew into,
Sure.
in college, because nobody really reads that stuff when they're little. The thing about whether academia doesn't reward it, that was just all true, and that's something that I hope is changing. But in terms of like the public not really knowing about it, I saw it as an opportunity. Nobody had ever done anything like, let's do something documentary like with philosophy, because philosophy is more lends itself more to like you and me sitting here talking about it, and like
Hmm.
that's traditionally how it's been. Like Plato wrote dialogues for a reason, right? It's really a bunch of people sitting around talking. And that's great for the podcasting format, but I thought that there was something more stylized that was more that's better for listeners who aren't familiar with things. So like if you actually know nothing about finance, right? And then there's all this stuff like yield curves and long-term versus short-term interest rates. You're like, who cares, right? But in the context of 2007, 2008, when those things all of a sudden were connected to things people really felt, then shows like Planet Money or Freakonomics Radio were able to blow up um, and inform the public in very technical matters. And I thought, there's no reason why philosophy can't do that, right? It's not like, okay, some of the stuff that we talk about is not connected at all, but a lot of it is, right? Even really abstract stuff like metaphysics is connected to a lot of what people like to think about nowadays, surprisingly, like multiverses and world building and
Hmm.
and virtual people and that kind of stuff. And so there's no reason why philosophy is such a large, vast field that somebody couldn't take a documentary style approach to it, like look for stories in the world journalistically and connect it to philosophical things that people were thinking about and talking about. And so I took it as a challenge, really. I approached it as a challenge. And then when it came to the academic, it's not rewarded in academia, it's not recognized in academia. That's true, except that I haven't really been drummed out of academia as a result of what I've been doing. Quite the opposite. What's really weird, and the thing that was least expected, is when I started, I thought, oh, I'm gonna have a ticket out. Like I have these other skills now that I can do, and then it'll be like attractive to public radio. But then I learned it's actually not that great in public radio or like professional podcasting. And then in academia, I was getting
Uh,
grants and I was getting recognition. And then this past year, I got a job offer and then I took it. Like that was not something that anybody, um, I wouldn't have thought that that would be true. And if anything, I thought the opposite would be true. And so what I saw out of that was that, um, as disillusioned I was with academia, it actually turns out that you can make people start caring about things in academia in a way that um, I didn't think was true before. So, like, if you decide to trailblaze in a certain way, then you could very well get the attention of some people, a department, a dean, or something. And then in my case, it was grant makers, people who have money and want to fund something. And in this case, and what I'm doing now is like I'm trying to pay it forward. I'm trying to like see where there's money to be um, gotten and give it all out to people who want to do something, not exactly like I'm doing, but there are people who want to do something like this for magazines, for something for newspapers, something for YouTube, or something. And
mhm.
maybe there's a trailblazer there that wants to do that and like make academia care.
Yeah. No, that's funny that you mention econ because, well, you chose a good example because I had always thought that econ was this stalwart in academia and had always been one of the most popular majors. So,
It's not true. It's not
yeah,
true.
I
Yeah.
hadn't realized that. So, the next thing that I was going to ask, because I was wondering as I was listening, was why you chose to structure the show as a narrative. And it seems like you had a pedagogical reason. I mean, you think it's easier to engage philosophically unsophisticated listeners with that sort of program. Um, is it also just part of satisfying a more creative drive? Is that also
It's
part of why you did it?
I would say that most of the psychological motivation, like if you had to peer inside my head, it was what you just described, right? I needed to do something that was more creative for myself than writing papers, right? And talking about philosophy in a free-form format was a continuation of that, like those people, those who don't know, like if you get a bunch of philosophers together, they very quickly, like devolve into like, I mean, it's like, it almost sounds like a caricature, but it really isn't. Like if you've been around conversations, it's kind of like, what if the alien spoke two languages, one of which was twin English, and then you're just like off to nobody knows what the hell you're talking about already, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like very
Oh, yeah.
quickly. It's like in a matter of like 2-3 minutes, right? I mean, funny. I was sorry. I was at a dinner the other week, and there were a bunch of philosophers and a bunch of non-philosophers, and the philosophers started talking about whether God occupies space or whether he and if he occupies space, does he have a shape at a certain space? And like very quickly it just becomes about this weird metaphysical question of what it takes to occupy B or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's that is something that was around that predated me, right? Like in philosophy podcasts. And then what predated me were like lecture style, someone who sat around and wrote a lecture. And if I did that, I could turn out a lot more content, honestly. But, it wouldn't have fulfilled that drive. But you're right. It also was true for pedagogical reasons in the following way. I think of programs like the ones I've just talked about as being for people who are already inclined and attracted to think and listen to people talk in that way. And I really do think that that's, I don't know, 1% of people. It might be very big. It might be, sorry, that's digital spiking here. It might be bigger than the audience for my show, but it's still like a certain kind of thinker. And I'm a strong believer in cognitive diversity. Like
Mm-hmm.
people think and come to information very differently. I've noticed that with mediums too. There are people who never listen to a podcast, right? Like, oh, I don't do that. I don't listen to that. Like, why? Like, it takes up so much of my time. I don't understand. But they say they only read stuff. And then there are other people who like take their news by audio. So for me, what I was convinced of in 2015-ish when I started this was the medium of audio, and in particular, the form audio storytelling was what I wanted to integrate with philosophy, precisely because storytelling as a form was never integrated very well with philosophy since Plato, I guess, right? I mean, like that was, I mean, I you're a philosophy student. Like, what's the last person who did a lot of narrative like stuff with their philosophy? Plato was it, wasn't it?
I have no idea.
That's right.
I
I
mean,
think
there are literary figures, obviously,
yeah,
who write philosophically, but it's not quite the same.
that's right. And so I was really taken in by the way that the narrative form, so having a character, having a plot, having twists and turns, having stakes in a right, was able to hold people's attention regardless of whether they were interested in an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You might not be particularly interested in real estate financing, but it's a very compelling narrative how the bottom dropped out of the housing market in 2007 and 8, right? You might not be particularly interested in the metaphysics of names, but you might be interested in the story of Larisha Hawkins, who was fired for claiming that Christians and Muslims worship the same God, right? And then you might suddenly think like, well, now you're open to a discussion of the various names that various religions give to God and whether that can refer to the same individual, fictional or real. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something philosophers have talked about for like at least 100 years, if not longer, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that I foresaw that there was a way to do that, and I thought that it didn't exist, and I wanted to give myself the challenge to do it.
Got it. Yeah, the pedagogical or the pedagogy question comes to me because I was thinking about how I would edit my program and whether or not I would edit it at all. And I decided that I like learning from these conversation type recordings just because I get to hear people waffling about topics. Sorry about the cat.
Oh
Waffling
yeah,
about topics, going back and forth, and you really get to hear more of the motivations behind the ultimate positions that people uh, fall into, and that I guess suits my form of cognitive diversity
yeah,
well.
yeah. I think that that's true of a lot of people. Like, it's not true anymore that the narrative form is the preferred form for people consuming information. The kind of that you're describing is actually more popular now, right? Like there are people who actually like sitting for 3 hour, 4 hour podcasts where people are delving deep into something. So another reason, I mean, I'm going to admit this now. I think I've admitted it elsewhere that I chose this format is I don't think I have a particularly attractive personality for that. Like when I look at radio and podcasts and I look at some of those popular host driven shows, I call them host driven because it really is the personality of the person that brings somebody in, right? Like, and I'm not going to name names, but we all know that there are some mega popular things, and it's not necessarily that the host has some expertise that nobody else has, right? And it's not particularly that the host is necessarily funnier than anybody else or anything like that, right? But it's still true that people are attracted to the personality of that host and they want to hang out with that person, and so whoever that person gets on to talk about, they're going to be interested. And just to admit it to myself, like I don't think I had that, right? But what did I have? I did have patience, editing skills, and a kind of ear for story, and just a drive to like be able to go out into the world and talk to the woman who claimed she was the reincarnation of Anne Frank, or right, or like sit around in Skid Row in Los Angeles and follow activists who are protesting against automated policing, or something like that. Like that I can do.
That was an interesting episode, by the way. Very good one.
Yeah, thank you. But being, cool to people, like I don't know, I've never had that.
Yeah, I guess I have to. You've made a good case for me working on my personality, I guess. But okay, well, actually, before we talk about some episodes, just very quick question.
Sure.
Tool of the trade. Your audio is great. What mic are you using?
Oh, I use the Shure SM7B.
Okay.
It's the go-to mic. I've been thinking about changing it up, but I mean, I think you have a Shure. That's the karaoke mic, isn't it? Oh no, that's a USB mic, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the ATR 2100X USB
Oh, okay.
mic.
Yeah. So that's the Shure SM7B is my studio mic, and then my travel mic is this one, which is the Audio Technica 8035. And so most of the earlier seasons pre-COVID, when I was able to go out and face to face with people, it's on this mic, and I actually think this mic sounds better.
Oh.
But this is it's like a condenser mic. So, anyways, yep.
Okay, well, I'm gonna look into the 7B, but the episodes actually that jumped out at me most, maybe just because they're the ones that I listened to most recently, since they were in season 5, are the series on monsters, and that's something that, I mean, even though we use thought experiments involving monsters or aliens speaking twin English all the time, it's hard to devote a career to writing papers on monsters. So I can see how this you get to explore some philosophical topics quite creatively. And what in particular prompted the 3-part series on monsters?
Great question. And the answer to that question is I was pitched that. I had, because of the pandemic and the stage that it was at, very little time, because I was chair of the department and teaching, to actually get a lot of tape and do a lot of research for stories. And I had all of this David Lewis tape. And so I was going to make that 4-part series on David Lewis, which I did last season. And then I had a few others, but then I needed like whatever it was, 3 or 4 other episodes. And Christina Van Dyke, who's a medievalist, and she's at Columbia at the moment. She had a little bit of time on her hands at that time, and she contacted me and she says, look, as a medievalist, what I'm really interested in is in monsters, because like what's really interesting to me about them is like when you read like Aquinas or you read a lot of the medievals, they cared a lot about cannibals. They cared a lot about the devil. They cared a lot about, eventually like people cared about vampires. There was like a lot of stuff that was, in an era where there wasn't a sharp distinction between natural and supernatural. A lot of philosophical questions were raised by the supernatural, right? Because if you were serious about the supernatural, you started thinking about how it's possible and how it's real.
Yeah, I actually I was at Columbia before I came to Stanford, so I just missed Christina Van Dyke, but I actually reached out to her because I would love to talk to her as well. But I had an episode with a friend of mine that was not particularly philosophical, but we were talking about zombies. And I'm not sure if it was your episode on zombies or not with Christina, but she mentions that it's useful to think about what the monster represents that's frightening to us. And in talking about zombies, I totally thought that everybody just thought the scary thing about zombies was that they overwhelm you. Like you're trapped, and then there are just hundreds of them. There's nothing that you can do, and they're going to sort of close in on you and suffocate you. But my friend that I was talking to, that was a secondary concern for him. His concern was being bitten by a zombie and then becoming a zombie. And I mean, you talked a bit. Yeah,
it's becoming.
You talked about that a bit. So why should it be frightening to become a zombie, or why shouldn't it be? Because that didn't even occur to me.
Yeah, the different kinds of zombies raise different kinds of anxieties, and it could vary between people, right? So a classic zombie in the Haitian tradition is somebody who is conscious but lacks free will, right? And so they are actually trapped inside.
Oh, really?
While their will is taken over and are under the control of the shaman or the medicine man, right? Or the bokor. And so that zombie is, and so the fear comes from the idea of watching yourself and experiencing the physical nature of yourself doing things against your own will, right? And that you could understand, like being afraid of.
Yeah.
But what you don't lose is conscious experience on that model. The zombie in the philosophical tradition is a being that lacks there is nothing it's like to be a zombie, right? So it lacks consciousness completely. So you'd have to, that's all underspecified in film, right? So in film, there's a way of understanding the zombie in the classical Haitian sense. But in the classical Haitian sense, they're not undead either, right? In film, they're supposed to be dead bodies, and I'm not sure whether or not there's something it's like to be a zombie in film. Right?
I mean, this isn't a question that we'll get a definitive answer on, but I have the sense that in most movies, like 28 days later, where they get the rage virus, they're not undead, so that's a little different. But I have the sense that it's somewhat like being a rabid dog or a dog in general. You just have less cognitive functions than a typical human. You're really just thinking about food. But is that not how you see most film zombies? You think of them
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how to think about it, but it really speaks to what you're supposed to be fearing and whether that fear is appropriate or rational fear. So in the philosophical literature, there's a big debate about this from in the 70s about rational fear in the theories of personal identity, right? So, for instance, like there was a lot of discussion about whether you should be afraid that you're going to be tortured after your memories are wiped, right? And then the idea was supposed to be, well, if you're afraid of that torture, that means you think you will still experience the torture, even though your memories would be wiped, in which case you don't think that you are what your memories are, right?
Yeah.
Like you're not the same. Though there was a big debate about that. And I think that's relevant here in the case of zombies. If you are afraid of what experiences would be like after you're bitten by a zombie, then that's different than being afraid of dying because the zombie bit you. But if you, but that's just fear of dying. Like we're afraid of dying too. What happens to your body after it dies is, who cares? You're not, you can care about it now, but you're not going to be afraid on behalf of the body. So like if I died normally and somebody said after your death, we're going to beat your body up with a baseball bat, you're not going to be like, oh, ouch, right? I mean, you might say that, but you're not going to be really afraid of that. In the case of zombies, there's this like question, right? Do you think, are you afraid of what it's going to be like after the zombie bites you? And if the answer is yes, then you're attributing consciousness to the body that you're in. And not only are you attributing consciousness to it, you're actually identifying with that consciousness, right? You're actually saying, I am going to experience, being the zombie. And that's what I fear. And that, if that's true, if that's what your friend is afraid of, if that's what people are afraid of in the case of zombies, then they really got to ask themselves, right? So really you're thinking that some fundamental essence of you survives being bitten by a zombie and is in fact experiencing certain things as a zombie. Mm-hmm. And that's fascinating if that's true. In the case of philosophical zombies like Chalmers zombies, those zombies really don't experience anything, right? So like if that's what happens to you after you get bitten, then it really would be an unreasonable fear, wouldn't it?
Could you explain what I don't think you said what a philosophical zombie is.
Sure.
Yet.
A philosophical zombie is something that doesn't have any consciousness at all, right? So there's nothing that it's like it doesn't have experiences. On the outside, it might do things consistent with having experiences, right? So Chalmers' zombies are zombies that are supposed to act just like us, but don't have any experiences. So you might think a really good AI chatbot that was put into a really good robot would be a philosophical zombie, right? Mm-hmm. So you're interacting with it. It looks kind of like a real person and talks like a real person and acts like a real person. But it actually turns out that there's nothing there except text input and generated outputs, right? It doesn't experience anything.
Yeah, I think the interesting questions, though, come when you imagine a philosophical zombie who is physiologically indistinguishable from you or I.
No, that's right. And so those, as far as I'm told by biologists, are we haven't found them yet, but like there are phenomena in nature. There are zombies in nature, right? There are zombified animals because of a fungal infection or some other kind of parasite that but they are kind of distinguishable in behavior. They're not distinguishable, but you could it's a pretty easy thing to imagine. That's why Chalmers became famous, right? Because like he says, like it's actually quite very easy to imagine what it's like to have something that really is indistinguishable physiologically from us, but isn't conscious.
I'm not sure. I think I read something Dan Dennett wrote in response to this some many years ago, but I'm sorry if I'm butchering Dan's opinion, but it was that this is almost like not. It's almost like worrying or trying to imagine a square circle. Like you're assuming already with this picture that consciousness is not something physiological and that it just is what our brains are. Maybe it's kind of like it's like saying what's fire, or can you imagine fire that's not hot? And it's like, well, that just is sort of what fire is like.
The limitations on what we can imagine and what we can conceive are still poorly understood, and poorly understood enough so that we shouldn't have, really, really high confidence when we do philosophy and say, because I can imagine this follows, right? It's not going to be conclusive like that. It's not a deductively valid and sound argument. There's some questionable premises there. So yes, I agree. Like we need to understand better what the limits of imagination are. Like there are lots of clever examples in philosophy of people saying, no, you're claiming to imagine that, but you're not really imagining it. You're thinking you imagine it, but you're not really imagining it.
Right. I think Dennett had another response to the Mary in the White Room thought experiment to that effect, where the Mary in the White Room thought experiment, for people who don't know, is from Frank Jackson. And the question is, so you have this woman who lives in a white room. She's a color scientist. She has all of the physical facts there are to know about color. But of course, she's never seen color because she lives in this white room. Now, when she leaves the white room and sees the color red for the first time, does she learn something? And namely, what it's like to see the color red. And most people's intuitive response to that is, of course, she learned something new, because you can't learn what it's like to see red from reading facts out of a book. But I think Dan Dennett's response is something like, you're really underestimating what it could possibly mean to have all of the possible physical information about something.
There's I mean, I'm sympathetic to Dennett's concerns. Forget about imagination for a second. We know from visual illusions that people can see certain things to be possible that aren't, right? Like Escher diagrams or weird paradoxical drawings. And it looks like it's possible to have a eternally ascending staircase, right? I mean, if it looks possible, then like it could be easily, a person could easily be deceived into thinking that it is possible. Like you're looking right at it, right? So like just build what you're seeing. So we know about that in the perceptual case. In the case of imagination, you might draw a parallel argument. You can say, if it's so easy to be taken in by a hidden, like by thinking something's possible when it really isn't, by looking, the things that you're being asked to imagine in the philosophical thought experiments, way more complicated than looking at an Escher thing, like, or looking at an illusory thing is like, I mean, it's one visual, it's within your visual field, right? It's like you could see it all at once. With the imagining whether Mary learns something, keeping fixed all of the stipulations, right? Do you understand every last aspect of the stipulation, right? So like Dennett's point is like, do you understand what it is to know everything about color on the basis of reading it? Like, like what are you keeping in your mind, right? At least with the visual thing, you can actually point and say, this is what I'm keeping in my mind all at once. So there's a good point to that. Philosophical thought experiments can be quite complex things. I'm not a skeptic about them though, right? So I don't generally think we know nothing on the basis of them. There are some people who think that, but epistemic modesty, right? The conclusions that you draw from such thought experiments are not as firm as and that, Frank Jackson's credit. Frank Jackson is as skeptical about that argument that he made years ago as anybody else is.
Well, I think that talking about the limits of imagination naturally leads us into the next creature I wanted to discuss, which was vampires. But before we get into maybe the philosophical concerns about vampires, one of the things that is great about your show is that it's not necessarily all philosophical. There's plenty of things that draw me in as a listener that don't have to do with quotes from obscure analytic papers. Right. And one of the things was that I was astonished to hear that there are real vampires.
Yeah.
in some respect. I mean, psychic and traditional.
Yeah.
So, could you tell me a bit more about your experience with these vampires?
Well, I haven't had any experience, but I talked to somebody who has a lot of experience with them. So real vampires are people who have a felt, we'll call it phenomenological need, right? So we don't know if it's physiological, right? But they have a felt need to periodically consume the blood by mouth of, let's say, other humans, but sometimes animals as well, uh, or their psychic energy,
Mm-hmm.
as they put it. And if they don't do this, they feel very weak. They even have changes that occur with their body and so forth. Uh, Doctors, scientists have studied them. They've been in the literature. They've been around for a long time. They're kind of a subculture in urban areas where they get together, and they get together and solicit volunteers who will allow the vampires to cut them open and consume their blood
Mm-hmm.
when needed. And yeah, that's who they are.
Yeah, that's crazy. But anyway, I mean, more philosophically
Yeah.
motivated is L.A. Paul's book on transformative experience. And when I read that book or think about the question, it comes down to imagination for me, but maybe
Yeah.
we'll get back to that. But so what is a transformative experience, and why? I mean, it's pretty natural that you chose this as your centerpiece for vampires, but how are the two
Yeah.
related?
Well, Laurie did, and Laurie Paul did. And I just, this, the second segment really is just an explication of Laurie's book, which is she chose vampires as one example, an imaginary example, but turns out not really imaginary because like there are actual vampires,
Mm-hmm.
where uh, you are confronted with a decision to become something else, where that something else is not something that you can imagine being like now.
Mm-hmm.
And being a vampire is Laurie's example, her opening example, which is if you were offered the choice to become a vampire, you can weigh the costs and benefits of it. But what you can't really do is know what it's like to be a vampire when
Mm-hmm.
you become one ahead
Right.
of time. Right. And so, really, when you make that change, it's transformative in that not only do you not know what it's like now, but but as the vampire, right, you can't really then go, oh, this is exactly what I wanted or whatever, because you could say that, but like you are now so different from what you were before. So it's not like you really can compare the experiences of what you're like now with like the experiences before and
Right.
determine now that you were like made the right choice or anything like that.
I don't recall whether or not it was you or Christina Van Dyke or Lori Paul, but somebody brought in the Twilight series, and
Yeah,
that
yeah. Me and
example made
Christina,
it
yeah.
very clear for me. So, um, Edward is the vampire, Bella is his human girlfriend, and she really wants to become a vampire, but he won't let her because, or he resists this because he knows how terrible it is, but she can't possibly know. And so she can't rationally make that decision. And in fact, she's irrationally trying to make it just based on her infatuation for him.
Yeah. And Laurie thinks that there are a lot of real world examples and people have
Mm-hmm.
contended with her particular ones. Like she claimed that having a child is like this,
Right,
becoming a parent. And I don't doubt that that's what it was like for Laurie. Of course, a
right,
lot of parents have since said, well, it's nothing like that.
right. I read
Right.
Elizabeth Harmon's paper on that topic.
Yeah.
She was one of the people who responded to L.A. Paul, and she believed that, or she argued that she knew enough about what it was like to be a parent from having a much younger sister, from getting the testimony of friends and family members, that she was able to make a rational decision about making a parent.
Right.
I mean, about becoming a parent, and that she had uh, sufficient knowledge to do so.
Yeah. There are others in real life examples of this. So I think going to war is like this. I've done a lot of episodes about war and a lot about soldiers going to war. Uh, there's definitely a disconnect between the people who haven't been in war and want to go to war, or the people who haven't been in war and don't want to go to war, and the people who have been through war. And there really is something very unifying about the community of people who have been in wars and people who haven't. So that's one example. From what everybody reports, certain drugs are this way. So
Yeah.
a lot of people who take psychotropic drugs, particularly ayahuasca and its related um, chemicals, have described the experience as a transformative experience that is not describable in language.
Right.
And can only be had by the experience itself.
People are always trying to convince you to do ayahuasca or things like
Right.
that, and I'm
Yeah.
I'm very skeptical. I have the feeling that these drugs are somehow infecting people's brains and making them like almost zombified ants or something. They're instructing them to try to get other
spread,
people to
yeah.
take these drugs.
Yeah. It sounds like the perfect Darwinian adaptive mechanism, right? Like
Precisely.
here is a plant that convinces everybody that it's absolutely necessary to consume the plant, thereby like requiring reproduction of the plant, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Have you read much Jorge Luis Borges?
When I was in college, but I don't
Okay.
remember a lot of it. Yeah.
So there's this story called Pierre Menard, author of the Don Quixote. Do you happen to know that one?
I don't know that one.
Okay. So Cervantes naturally is the actual author of the Don Quixote, but in this story there's this character that we'll call him the protagonist, Pierre Menard, and he so desperately wants to write the Don Quixote that he gradually sort of sculpts his life so that he can become Cervantes. So he starts living his life exactly as Cervantes does, and eventually, I mean, it's been a while since I read it, but he becomes indistinguishable from Cervantes, and then can thus authentically write the Don Quixote as an original piece of work. And this came to mind when I was reading L.A. Paul's book, because I think that she underestimates on some level the power of human imagination and whether or not we can know what it's like to be certain things. So I happen to be writing some stories about vampires right now, and I am very convinced that I can figure out what it's like to be a vampire.
I mean, if you think about what is called method acting,
yeah,
right, that'd be another great example of this, right? Like, you can make the case that Daniel Day-Lewis has a really strong sense of what it is like to be, Lincoln or something like that, right? As much as any human being could possibly know what it's like to be another human being.
So then there comes the third of the creatures that you talked about, and this one happened to be the most surprising and interesting to me. Surprising because I didn't know how you were going to make cannibals philosophically interesting, and then surprising because of the way you did it. So how did cannibalism become an interesting philosophical topic for you?
Again, thank Christina.
Thank Christina.
Cannibals turned out to be a very obsessed over topic in Christian theology. And she claims in other theological traditions. I don't know whether that's true or not. Just as an aside, in general, there's this thing I like to do on Hi-Phi Nation, which is like start off a topic and people are going to think, oh, he's going to talk about whether it's right or wrong. But then it's nothing about whether something's right or wrong, right? Like, it's not like that episode's about whether cannibalism is good or bad or right or wrong at all, right? So I like the twist, which is that in Christian theology, what interested me generally is how much metaphysics comes from Christian theology, how much metaphysics in the Western tradition. And in Christian theology, the philosophical issue around cannibals was about the Christian resurrection. If you're committed to the idea that individuals are resurrected in the afterlife, and you believe that the tenets of Christianity require you to value the body, so that, the reason why you have Jesus on earth is because the body's valuable. The reason why Jesus has to be resurrected is because the body of Jesus is valuable, right? It's kind of like, it's important that it's not just as we would call it in philosophy, Platonic, right? It's like the idea of just a mind or a spirit can ascend to heaven. That if you thought both of those things, then you run into a problem of how you resurrect individuals in a world where cannibals exist, right? And because cannibals eat other people, and so part of the cannibal is made up of the parts of other people. So if the cannibal gets resurrected in order to be sent to hell, and the victim, who maybe gets sent to heaven, is resurrected as well, there's not enough bits left over, so there are holes in one of the two individuals. And that's a specific problem. Like, you might call this a metaphysical problem of world building, right? Like, if you're not religious, then you're not going to be taking this as a serious, real question. But you can definitely take it as a serious, logical question, right? You're writing a story about something and you're building a consistent world, like you are in Harry Potter or the Avengers universe or something. And all of a sudden you come across this problem, which is in your world, everything gets resurrected and their bodies, right? And in your world, all of the bodies are made up of material that was consumed by an individual of another, right, with other bodies. So then how do you make resurrect? Oh, and also in your world, the resurrection is timeless, right? So it's not like one happens first and something happens later or something, right? Like everybody gets there. I think this is true. I'm not sure. I'm not a Christian theologian, but I think like everybody comes before God, and it's not like one person came in 1640 and the other person comes before God. Like God's not in time, I think. So if you think all that, then you're
does he occupy space?
Yes, does he occupy space and time? Like, these are other issues, right? The metaphysics. And so they start thinking about, so that episode's really about what the Christians thought, how they could fit it all together, right? So they try to fit it all together by fixing things. And what interested me is that this is all of science and metaphysics too, right? Like, sort of the point of metaphysics of science, say, if you're like trying to put together special relativity or quantum mechanics, or the point of like economists, economics, is that you're trying to fit together this tenet with this phenomena and this other tenet. Like, all of like human intellectual activity seems to be like this. Like, we have these commitments, we're trying to put them all together. Not all of them fit. And if they do fit, then we have to say really weird things about, the human body and so forth. So that's what interested me in general, like the extent to which really, really smart minds across centuries and centuries were trying to solve what otherwise might be a silly problem, which is, how can you resurrect both a cannibal and his victim at the same time? But it's like sort of a, people can find that amusing, except for that's what we're doing, right? Like, period, everywhere.
Yeah, I like this idea of treating it as a world building problem.
That's how I think about it as a non-Christian, as a secular person, right? I think of a lot of, I like to explain a lot of philosophical problems to people who aren't interested in the Christian aspect of it. Like, their faith doesn't depend on it or something, as a world building problem, because world building is something that is, I think,
we're storytellers. We all are.
Yeah. And I really do feel that, it's one of those things that defines philosophy. Like, people say, what's the definition of philosophy? And I think that's one of them. I don't think it's the only one, but philosophy is the attempt at consistent world building. Right. And
yeah. That's very much in line with David Lewis.
Yeah.
It's also, though, a very nice, I think, going back to the pedagogy, it's a very nice pedagogical move because it makes the non-Christians interested in the topic as well when you treat it this way. It's just a puzzle that anybody can be interested in solving.
Yeah, and going all the way back to the first season, that's how I thought of the Name of God episode about whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God. In case of Larisha Hawkins, there was a human story. A human being actually got reprimanded for holding a view like that. And it's a theological dispute that will continue long after I'm dead. But it's also precisely a question, if you don't care about the theology or anything, I thought of that as a world building, right? So you have a history where what we would call three different religions have subsumed each other's worlds within their own. And that's just true. Mm-hmm. That's not even, it's not a controversial thesis. Given that that's true, does that commit people to certain things, right? To have a consistent world as told by Islam, to have a consistent world as told by Christianity, to have a consistent world as told by Judaism, must you accept that you have, that if there's one, that if all of them have one God, right? There's a unity to their God, that it doesn't really matter what the word for it is. So all of the different words must refer to that same thing. I think that somebody who's not religious at all can be taken in by that question, right?
It's actually one of the questions that I think I was thinking about as like a 4-year-old or 3 or 4-year-old, because my dad's side is Jewish, my mom's side is Lutheran, and then I went to Catholic school. And
right.
Even though my dad in particular isn't religious, I mean, I would go to his parents' house for holidays, and my mom would make me go to Lutheran Sunday school, and we'd have all sorts of religion classes at Catholic school. And I had these 3 competing faiths telling me something about like ostensibly the same God, and it was just very confusing. And I thought, well, all 3 people can't be right. I mean, who's right? But there's no way to really decide that. So it seems more likely that they're all wrong.
Right. I see young children as being very pure in their philosophical judgments. I see it in my own child as well, and that was a very pure like judgment, unencumbered by years and years of indoctrination, right?
Mm-hmm. So one of the, and you mentioned it earlier than I mentioned it, but aside from the monster series, I think the series or episodes that jumped out at me most was the ones concerning David Lewis. Now, is that something that somebody pitched to you, or was it because of your affiliation with Princeton, or what brought that one up?
Oh, so that's an interesting story. It didn't even start as a Hi-Phi Nation project. During season, I don't remember what it was, 3 or something like that, or the work up to season 3, I was invited down to the Australian National University to spend like 8 weeks. And I did, and I got some tape down there, and I made some shows out of it. In that trip, I knew from my days at Princeton, I didn't know David Lewis. He passed away my first week in graduate school. I knew that he was
wait. Was that part of the reason you went to Princeton though, because he was there?
Actually, no. There were a lot of people who went there because of David Lewis.
Yeah, that would have been a real shock.
It was a shock to the people who went there for David Lewis. Yeah, I was in the philosophy of science at the time, and I think Von Frossen was there, and I think that's the reason I had gone. But I found myself in Australia, and I knew that David made a second home in Australia, and so while I was there, and who knows whether I have a chance to be there again, I decided that it would be a good idea to collect people's oral histories of David Lewis while they were still alive, because all of his friends were getting up there, right? So Frank Jackson and who else? I mean, there were a lot of people down there. Students of David Armstrong. I found David Armstrong's niece, and that was fortuitous. It wasn't even like I was looking for her. We were some other event, and she says, "Oh, I'm David Armstrong's niece," and so I thought to do that only because I wanted to make sure we had accounts of his life from the people who were there before they all passed away. So I collected all of that and I kept it. Oh, and then at the end of that summer, Steffi was sick, and so I knew that Steffi wouldn't be around for much longer.
David Lewis's wife?
It's David Lewis's wife, Steffi Lewis. So I went to her house and I interviewed her for about 3-4 hours and collected that tape, and she, passed away very soon after that. And so I had all of this tape, and I thought I was just going to collect it and like put it in archives or something. And then the pandemic hit, and I wanted to put down another season of the show. And something that I had never done, never thought I would be doing, would be biographical nonfiction. Right. And I thought, oh, another challenge, right? Mm-hmm. Because like biographical nonfiction is a totally different ballgame now, right? Now you're not talking about finding, connecting David Lewis with some movie about time travel or about possible worlds, but like David Lewis's life, right? And, it's done. So like, John Nash, A Beautiful Mind is another Princeton-based,
right,
genius worship type film and book. And so I decided that, okay, here's a good challenge for me. I already have the tape. I can always talk to people there's a lot of David Lewis scholars out there that know a lot about David Lewis. So I could always talk about the philosophy. So that's the inspiration. And so I had the tape and I had, connections to Princeton. So I thought, okay, let's just do as many episodes as I think I can do and see what happens, because nobody else is talking about David Lewis. Nobody else has a book about him for the general public. There's a lot going on for philosophers, his papers and so forth. So I did that. And, like a lot of things I do, like, I don't know how much it's hit outside of philosophy, but the philosophy world really liked it, I guess.
Yeah, I really liked it because I didn't know anything about him. I knew the man who wrote about Argle and Bargle and time slices. Was there any of his work that particularly spoke to you, or any of his papers that you really liked discussing his ideas about in the show?
In the show,
or outside the show?
My taste in David Lewis personally was towards his earlier, more technical work on convention, on language, on semantics. That's sort of the stuff that I was really into.
Okay, because you started out with epistemology and philosophy of language, right?
That's right. Okay. That's right. Those were my expertise. So I got into graduate school with a paper on conventions, and
so he might have been the one to accept you.
Yeah, that's as far as I know. And so I knew enough about his metaphysical views because I took a metaphysics course. I TA'd for a metaphysics course with Karen Bennett when I was at Princeton. So I knew enough, but it wasn't my thing, right? So like the people who are really into metaphysics and are David Lewis worshipers, it's like a disciple thing, right? Like there are people who are like, they know every last bit about David Lewis. They're working on David Lewis metaphysics. There's a very distinctive feel to a paper where you're like, oh, this is a David Lewis type scholar here. That wasn't me. So I was happy to learn about a lot of that kind of stuff. One of the great things about this show is that it allows me to be the generalist that I am. Like academic philosophy requires you to be a specialist, but I've never really been that way by disposition. I've always been more of a generalist. So I like being wider than deep, even though I like being deep, but
Yeah, that's how I feel about this show too. I've gotten to talk to a lot of people I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So you mentioned that you had about an hour, which has been great. Do you have another 5 or 10 minutes, or
yeah,
do
go,
you?
yeah, please.
Okay, cool. Well, then I'm gonna ask you some more self-serving questions.
Sure, I'd love to
So,
answer them.
as somebody who's recently gotten into this space, and granted, I don't have to do as much technical work as you do. How did you become such an expert producer so quickly? Because I mean, even with the first season, it's not something. Well, maybe you were making it out of your garage, but it doesn't seem that way.
I was. And the answer that I'm going to give you, people are really surprised at how specific it is. Here's the answer. The answer is you Google Ira Glass, how I work. Ira gave an interview many years ago where someone says, how do you do this? The thing that you do, right? Interview some people, collect the tape, design out what story's going to be, and so forth. And he was very specific about it, right down to the pen and the paper and the microphones and like where he goes and then what he does afterwards. And I just followed those instructions in that first year. Right.
Okay, I'm really glad I asked you that.
Yeah. I just followed those instructions. I mean, you can't just follow them because like, the instructions is like requires some creative thinking about like the thing that person you just interviewed, how to structure that into a story. But, by the way, it's easier to follow those instructions now because you can get automatic transcriptions now. Even 6 years ago, I had to do it by hand,
Mm-hmm.
So I followed those instructions and made a pilot. And then I had friends, family, and other philosophers listen to them and critique them, right? So basically you need somebody to tell you what you're doing wrong, what you're doing boring, and so forth. And you have to believe that you can do it, right? So like nobody had ever done what Ira does, but for philosophy. So that was the part that was new, right? Like how do you connect the story to philosophy? And if you do all of that, the things that aren't hard is going into a digital audio workstation and like cutting up the interview tape and then like soundtracking it or something. Like if people think about that's like the production, the sound of the production. That's not that hard. That's something you can learn within a month of like actually doing it, right? The thing that's always hard, even to this very day, and everybody will tell you, is with a bunch of footage, how to structure that into a coherent 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever it is, right? That's the stuff that's an ongoing struggle. The technical thing about like which, DAW to use and then like how do you splice this and you put in room tone, it's like, that's not that, it's not that hard at all.
Have there been any particularly challenging moments above every single episode putting it together?
There are so many challenging moments to doing this.
For me at this point, the biggest challenge is reaching out to people, because it's very hard. Yeah, it's just an email. They might not have to read it, but it's hard to put yourself out there and ask people like a leader in their field. And then the other thing is it's just kind of nerve-wracking before sitting down before every interview thinking, oh, well, what if I fuck this up? But I guess those aren't the huge challenging moments I was asking about.
Yeah, I think that is an indication of you being of what kinds of things that you're concerned with about yourself and your skills. Everybody is going to be insecure about the things that they consider themselves weakest at, right? So for you, it's probably going up to a stranger, like, and then like talking to them. And I do think that that's definitely, so yes, I did a show where it required me to do vox pop, which is I went to the Brooklyn Public Library and walked up to strangers to interview them. That's not something a philosophy professor ever does. And that was horrible, an experience. Yeah. But I'm glad I did it. So I know, because I make my students do it. So like if they want to produce podcasts, I make students
What
do
was
that.
horrible about it?
Um,
Just it
approach.
felt horrible, or
Yeah, it
were
felt
there bad
horrible.
things?
There
Okay.
were some bad things, but like people say, no, I don't want to talk to you. But like the act of walking up to a stranger and asking them if you can ask some questions, a highly unnatural act.
Hmm.
Um, in a social, it's not something that people do. And but other people who are like extroverted and all that, like don't care, right? Like they
Hmm.
do that all the time. Uh, I think that's challenging. Um, I find the writing process very challenging. And I don't mean writing the philosophy stuff, even though that's challenging too, because I'm not writing philosophy for my peers. I'm writing for people who don't know anything about philosophy. That's challenging, but one thing I'm not really talented at is writing good nonfiction narrative, which some people are really good at. So what's that? Character development, character description, plot hanging on plot points for cliffhangers, the kind of thing that we see all the time in fiction writing that people are good at. Like, so I'm not very good at that, so I don't do a lot of it. But the people who do a really good version of that, I really admire. I wish I could be more like them.
Hmm. So this is one question that I've always liked when interviewers ask people. Now, if you could go back and give yourself some advice when you started, so roughly, uh, I think this is episode 35, so I haven't like totally started, but it still feels like I'm just starting. But what advice would you give yourself?
Oh, wow. Let me think about this for a second. The advice I would give myself is you don't have to use that much music.
Okay.
Number one. Um, it's okay that it feels hard because it is hard and it will stay hard. Um, and I mean, I think what I really needed in the early days was assurance than it is that I needed advice about how to do things better, because I actually think there was a certain aspect of the earlier shows which I like more than the newer shows. There was a kind of like novelty to them and energy about them that when you're more experienced, you kind of fall into a pattern that's a little bit less exciting.
Yeah.
Um,
I see that with some of my favorite musicians. I mean, they're where I don't listen to anything after their first or second album because that's when it was like
yeah,
raw.
yeah. Um, and the other advice I would tell myself is make sure you seek help. So I did seek help, but not having a budget. My excuse was always I don't have a budget, to get like a professional editor or something like that. But that's something that I'm continuously open to, because I do feel like Hi-Fi Nation could. I feel like what the show needs is more people working on it. like that it's not just the culmination of one particular person's way of thinking about stuff. That's what I think.
So I know that you're going to UCR, so
Yeah.
congratulations on that. Have are they in some way like supporting the public philosophy endeavors you have going on now?
Yes. So in the sense that unlike at Vassar and unlike anywhere else I could be, UCR is going to count my work on Hi-Fi Nation as work, as a professor's work, right? So like whether I
Wow,
get a raise or whether I get promoted, right? It's like it'll count as the same way like a publication would count.
that's awesome.
And
I'm so
that's
glad to
that's
hear that.
that's not something that existed. As
Hmm.
far as I know, it still doesn't exist anywhere else. I'm not sure. I
Well,
don't want to say. Yeah.
hopefully you've normalized it, and in a few years, I'll reap
That's
the fruits
that's
of
the
that
hope.
labor.
That's the hope, right? Yeah, I can't
Hmm.
rely on young people to take that risk, right? So like I was tenured when I started the show, so I wasn't taking the biggest risk. I mean, for you, you're taking a much bigger risk, right?
Yeah,
So I
a
mean,
little bit.
yeah, that's right.
Well, okay. The last thing I'll ask today is, what should we expect for season 6?
Season 6 about the future. So season 6
Okay,
is going
that's
to have some
awesome.
futuristic stuff. There's going to be talk of AI. There's going to be an episode about people who are in love with their AI chatbots.
Are you
People,
going to talk about her?
uh, yeah, it's kind of. I'm going to have to talk about her because that
Mm-hmm. That was a great movie.
predated this, but really, I'm talking to actual people who are in love with their AI chatbots now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
More interesting.
So you're going to hear about from them. I'm probably going to do an episode of people who have recreated their dead loved ones too. I'm going to talk about the future of animal rights. Like, what would it be like to live in a society where animals have some legal rights? And there's going to be, there's going to be a lot of stuff about the future.
Okay, well, I'm really looking forward to that, and maybe we'll be able to talk again about some of those episodes after it comes out. So thanks a ton for joining me.
Yeah, thank you.